In March 1936, Hitler ordered his troops across these bridges into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone controlled by France since the end of the First World War. His action was in direct breach of all international treaties. It was Hitler's greatest gamble. He believed he risked war. But even at this crucial moment, Hitler knew that the King of England was on his side. Edward was closely following developments from his home at Fort Belvedere near Windsor Castle. An extraordinary account of the King's reaction to the events in the Rhineland was left by Fritz Hesse, the press attaché at the German embassy in London. He reported to Berlin a conversation he had overheard between Edward and the German ambassador in London.
Edward said, I sent for the Prime Minister and gave him a piece of my mind. I told the old so-and-so that I would abdicate if he made war. There was a frightful scene, but you needn't worry. There won't be a war.
According to Hesse, the German ambassador Leopold von Hirsch danced with joy. He said, I have done it. I have outwitted them all. There won't be a war. The King's support was passed on to a grateful Hitler, who had feared an immediate armed response from Britain. Hitler's advance into the Rhineland became the defining moment in the descent to war. And not for the last time, he was influenced by Edward's support.
What he did was to let a foreign government know, foreign government with whom his own government was in dispute, that he differed from his government's policy, and that if this came to the crux, he would do his best to make this clear and overrule them. Now that is, by any standard of behavior, totally unconstitutional. And I can't talk of treason in this, but if it had been done by somebody who was bound by the oath of loyalty to the Crown or the Official Secret Act or anything like that, one can't help feeling that they would, a very dim view would have been taken of them by the authorities.
Edward's insistence on asserting himself politically was already causing consternation in government circles. There was great anxiety about the security of cabinet papers going to Fort Belvedere for the King's approval. The new German ambassador, Joachim von Ribbentrop, was frequently visited by Wallis Simpson. The danger she represented was soon confirmed to Prime Minister Baldwin by one of his cabinet ministers, Sir Walter Runciman. His son recalls the occasion.
My father one day had been at a cabinet meeting in the morning. Late in that evening, he had to go to a reception where, rather to his annoyance, he found himself having to talk to Ribbentrop, who was then ambassador. And Ribbentrop started telling him, or talking to him about what the cabinet had been discussing that morning. And it became perfectly clear that Baldwin had, of course, at once told the King what had been discussed. And so, the King must have told Mrs. Simpson at once, and she'd gone round to the German embassy.
By the summer of 1936, many in the establishment thought that Edward's behavior was unacceptable. The couple's pro-German and fascist tendencies were well known in inner circles. The suspicion that they could be leaking cabinet secrets to Berlin was a logical conclusion. Increasingly, Edward was seen as a security risk. The Foreign Office took the dramatic step of withholding sensitive state papers and diplomatic boxes from the monarch. In August 1936, Edward further angered his critics when he set off on a yachting cruise of the Adriatic with Wallis Simpson, completely ignoring the advice of the government. Not one word of his affair had been reported in the British press. Elsewhere, it created headlines, with speculation that Edward might even try to make her queen.
So far as I can make out, there was a feeling among the old establishment that the king was not being kingly enough, that he was indiscreet in his private conversation as well as his private life, that he was a rash man with whom to trust any secret that was at all deep, that he didn't bother to read his boxes in the way that his father had done.
In 1948, Professor M.R.D. Foote was a young student working on a history of the Times newspaper. At the time, he saw an extraordinary file of letters which confirmed that powerful political and even religious figures had been uniting against Edward.
It was a three-sided correspondence between Geoffrey Dawson, the editor of the Times, Canon Don of Westminster, who was understood to speak for the Archbishop of Canterbury, and one of the very senior men at the palace, I forget whether Harding or Lascelles. And the three of them agreed in the summer of 1936, that as a king, the king wasn't much good. And the other two asked Dawson if he would mind sounding out Dominion opinion about what the Dominions thought of the prospect of Mrs. Simpson as queen. They didn't want to go through the Dominion office. Dawson was well placed to do this. He had plenty of friends in Canada and some in Australia and in New Zealand, responsible editors who could understand which way public opinion was going, and he sounded them all out and reported back that they were all of one accord that the old Dominions wouldn't think of having Mrs. Simpson as queen. And the three decided that this would be, she would provide a good excuse for getting rid of the king.
It was not just in the far reaches of the empire that the plotters sought support. In September 1936, the ringleaders met at this country house in Hampshire on the pretext of a shooting party. Their aim was to force the king out. Even Chancellor Neville Chamberlain agreed something had to be done about Edward.
I think they were absolutely determined to be rid of him, and I think they found Mrs. Simpson an absolutely marvelous excuse, a gift from the gods, because they wanted to be rid of him. He represented everything they found most inconvenient, and also they greatly resented his refusal to play ball with what he thought were outdated social conventions.
In October 1936, the Simpson divorce came through. While British newspapers were silent, the foreign press predicted that Mrs. Simpson would marry the king within a year.
King Edward's romance holds the attention of the world, and in London, the drama of empire unfolds. Crowds like this surround Buckingham Palace to prove to the king that all the world loves a lover. Except perhaps Prime Minister Baldwin, leader of the government's fight against the marriage.
Mrs. Simpson was now an additional and pressing reason for the king's removal. But if she was to be the public excuse, the establishment would need more ammunition. There was nothing Edward's critics could legitimately do to prevent him marrying Wallis, but they could destroy her reputation.